Thank you, everybody. It's really a tremendous pleasure to be here. And I was thinking when I was listening to the opening remarks, in some way I feel already going to be adopting the ASEAN way in some way, and that I feel like I agree with, we're all covering similar ground and agreeing in consensus here. But let me just say first, many thanks to Meli and Bunyan and RSIS. It's really been a tremendous pleasure to work with everyone over the course of the past year. As has been mentioned, this report is the product of a year-long project conducted by IPI in partnership with both the Republic of Singapore through the mission and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and RSIS. And in particular, I just wanted to say I'm really deeply grateful to Singapore's mission in New York, and specifically the permanent representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Burhan Ghafoor, who you all should feel really proud of. He's really a big force in a small package in New York, and it was really a sincere privilege to work with him and learn from him and his whole team over the course of the past year. And of course, it goes without saying that I'm really grateful for the partnership with RSIS and to my co-authors here, Joel and Karen. You'll be hearing from them shortly, but it's just been a tremendous pleasure working with you. So thank you. We've come to the end of this long road, but we were just sort of scheming earlier, like trying to think about let's cook up something else to do together, because it's a great team. So I think hopefully we'll have time for discussion to get into some of the ideas, but I was asked to speak a bit about the process that led to the project and the report as an outcome document before Karen goes a bit into more depth on the research side. And so I thought maybe what I could do is give a bit of the who, what, where, when, and critically why this work. It was mentioned a bit about who IPI is. Just to say that the International Peace Institute, IPI, which was originally founded as International Peace Academy, is what you might be thinking of, is an independent non-for-profit organization dedicated to strengthening inclusive multilateralism for a more peaceful and sustainable world. We're right across the street from the United Nations and have been since the founding, so our work is really very dedicated to engagement with that community. So we've never really had a substantial presence here in Asia. We work very closely with many of the regional missions in New York, but it is worth noting that 2 out of 3 of the organization's founders were from the region. That included UN Secretary General U Thant of Burma and Indian Major General and UN Military Advisor Indarjit Ricky. They joined American philanthropist Ruth Forbes Young to establish the organization in 1970. And I just note that just because of being here, I'd like to think that IPI has Asia in its DNA in some way in that respect. So over the project, as I said, is noted, took place over the course of a year. Over the course of 2023 and 2024, IPI convened a series of roundtables in our space in New York, specifically on small states and the big topic of the year in New York that everybody was kind of obsessed with, and that is the future of multilateralism. And we did that in partnership with FOSS and Singapore. You coined the word FOSS for good. During the context of this work, we started to call Ambassador Ghafoor the FOSS boss, because he really has that convening power, and people listen to him. So we worked with the FOSS boss in collaboration with others, a core group of ambassadors from Bulgaria, Costa Rica, Jamaica, Jordan, Liechtenstein, New Zealand, Qatar, Samoa, Senegal, and Switzerland. All help convene these roundtables. And the PR of New Zealand was in every single one and participated really wonderfully in every single one. So the 3 ambassadorial roundtables at IPI. In October, we had a roundtable on championing the Charter and international law. In March, a roundtable on more broadly on issues related to small states and global governance writ large. A roundtable then in May on managing the challenges of emerging technologies and frontier issues, something that is not always discussed in the context of small states, but is extremely important. And then then the process kind of, I think, got momentum, and there was a 4th organized separately at the UN in partnership with Estonia in April on defending the UN Charter. Each roundtable featured around 30 ambassadors from a broad cross-section of FOSS members from Europe to Asia, South Pacific, Latin America, and the Caribbean, Africa. And then in addition, when Karen and Joel came into town, we did some interviews to also supplement the research with a series of small states representatives. So the paper comes out of all of these discussions, plus additional interviews and some fantastic desk research that I really was really all to RSIS's efforts. The timing of the project is, of course, important. The when informs the why. And as was mentioned, the project was, as conceived, really with Singapore, was geared to facilitating constructive inputs by small states into the Summit of the Future process, which was noted held in September, and at which, quite significantly, 193 heads of state and government agreed in consensus to what is known as the Pact for the Future, which charts out commitments to over 50 action points to strengthen international cooperation and transform global governance. We were in New York. It was such a strong topic of conversation, the Pact for the Future, the Summit of the Future and such, and yet during the course of the year, I traveled quite a bit to capitals and such, I noted that most people around the world weren't paying attention, and I imagine that was the same here. Now I think after the agreement, they're starting to get a little bit more of a sense of what was accomplished. I do think, actually, you mentioned small states maybe weren't instrumental in getting it agreed, but I would say that small states were actually very critically important in actually putting this thing over the line. So it's a real example of small states' role in the system. So why? Why is this important, and where does this work fit in? I think, everybody is no doubt aware that widening geopolitical divisions are somehow one of the defining characteristics of our time. Somehow you can't get away from it. And yet, when I reflect upon those conversations, those roundtables, the discussions that we hosted at IPI among a geographically, politically, and economically diverse group of UN member states, all with populations near or under 10 million, small states. One of the striking features about that is how they reflected a remarkable amount of common interests, common concerns, and common commitments. It seems with each passing day we are reminded in some respect of the division in the world, but it is very important to remember that in a very crucial respect, the world is not as divided as we are often told that it is. Among the over 100 small states assembled by FOSS, convened by Singapore, there is truly broad agreement on the need to support international law, multilateral cooperation, the institutions of global order, and the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. I will also quote your Prime Minister from his video remarks for the launch. Why are small states so supportive? Because, as Prime Minister Wong said in his video remarks to the launch of the report at the UN in September, quote, for small states, strong, effective multilateral system based on international law is not just a necessity, it is existential. Small states are proven champions of the multilateral system. They need the system, but the system needs them. At a time when multilateralism needs champions, small states are those proven champions. In an international legal system based upon the sovereign equality of states, small states, as the majority of UN member states, have a very particular role to play in building that better future. And indeed, in spite of their size and relative geopolitical power, small states have indeed had a concrete impact on the multilateral system in the past. And I think their influence has only grown over time. As was mentioned, during the Pact of the Future process, Singapore convened what became known as the Small States Group, sort of a subset of FOSS. 64, I think, or 63 member states ultimately became the group. And they convened common positions in the context of the debate over the Pact of the Future. And I don't think you can underestimate the influence that had. It was impactful. So in this context, before I turn it over to Karen for more specific dive, the report does three things. It provides some concrete examples, historically, of how small states have made a difference in the development of global governance as champions of international law, stewards of the global commons, and innovators at the frontiers of multilateral action. It examines some of the tools of the trade that small states may use to have an effective impact on the multilateral system, and then it provides some concrete recommendations, which maybe we can go into in the discussion, in particular about thinking about how small states can help to implement these 53 action points on the Pact for the Future and beyond. Just to close, the transnational issues that we all are confronted with at the heart of our shared future can only be addressed through international cooperation. And as we say in the report, it is an all-hands-on-deck moment, and it is in the interest of all states that all hands have the tools required for success. And it is our small ambition that this report can help provide some of those tools to small states for a better future.
Good afternoon, everyone. So as Adam said, a very brief overview of the report, so I'm tasked to go into detail. Well, I'm sure that you have a copy of them at your hand. So but I could make my presentation strictly based on the report's content, but I think it would be the most beneficial to you if I share with you the story of the behind-the-scenes story, the making of the report, so you understand more about our thought process, and when you read the report, you understand it more fully. So let me elaborate on Adam's point by giving you more backgrounders to the report. So the report is actually born out of our observation regarding international system and governance. We noticed that the world is undergoing a period of global transformation. So first of all, the international power dynamics have shifted from we've observed in the past, right? If you think about the post-Cold War era, where U.S. supremacy U.S. supremacy exists, right? But now we don't see that anymore. We're seeing emerging new markets coming up, and voicing their concern, demanding for reform at the international system. And the second observation is that the world is witnessing intensifying power rivalries among major powers. We're seeing that major powers are violating international rules, norms, and principles, such as the non-discrimination principle enshrined by the WTO agreement. And moreover, we see that the world is becoming more intertwined than before, right? So let's think about global supply chains which connect our economies together, right? And also, global problems now arrive at our doorstep. So imagine that you wake up and you want to go out of your house, you open your door, and you feel the heat, right? And many people are saying Singapore is too hot, right? And that you feel the effect of global warming, which Singaporeans may not fully contribute to it, right? But you have to suffer from it anyway. So that means what? That means that we are living in a world where our problem is their problem and their problem is our problem. It's vice versa. So challenges become transnational. And with transnational challenges, we need transnational solution to address them, right? Yeah. But think about that further. Finding transnational solution is not easy. And why so? It's because the issues somehow being intertwined, getting more complex, right? In the past, we used to think that trade, economic development, and environmental issue of climate change are separate from each other. But now it's not anymore, right? We have to think about everything altogether as enshrined by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, right? We have to think about development in terms of sustainability, inclusiveness, etc. Right? So issues are more intertwined, meaning that we also face another challenge in this era, which is that how to come up with effective transnational solution for transnational problem. So also, I think Alan touched a bit on the frontier issue. I'd like to elaborate on it. We have also facing challenges from frontier issues such as cyberspace and AI. Right? You think about that, these new developments are actually providing a lot of opportunities for society, for economies, right? But they also pose unprecedented challenges to states. And the frontier issues is where international governance is sparse. So that means what? That means we have little global solution to help states address the issue at hand, right? So I listed a few, but I think it's an example to show you the myriad of challenges facing the world today. So we use this to craft a section on multilateralism at crossroads. We think this section is necessary because it's imperative for us now to think how global governance would look like in the future and how to make it work in the period of global transformation. So moving forward, we're still observing that in this environment, we are having a positive development, especially the collective action made by collective action made by small states, like what DG Bun Hian mentioned in her opening remarks. We noticed that despite that small size and limited resources, small states are actually working together diligently and tirelessly to maintain, uphold, and champion multilateralism. What we also noticed that sometimes the effort of small states go unnoticed, right, as compared to big powers. So we then crafted this another section of the report called Small State Commitment and Contribution to the Multilateral System, because we want to highlight the significance of small states in shaping global governance, and also want to showcase their unwavering dedication to the development of the multilateral system. And as cited in the report, we used the quote by the permanent representative from St. Vincent and Grenadines, about the metaphor that small state ends and be and actually vital to the international ecosystem, just to showcase how the crucial role that small states play in shaping up multilateralism. And also, but we don't want the story about small states to end there. We want our report, as Adam mentioned, to drive real changes, to drive real actions in the real world in years to come as well. So we are very benefited from the roundtables organized by IPI in New York, as well as more in-depth interviews that we also conducted in New York with specific permanent representative to the UN. We used their insight to craft the section called How Small States Make a Difference in the Multilateral System. So in this part, we identify key broad roles that small states play in contributing to multilateralism. Agents of international peace and security, champions of international law and multilateralism, stewards of the global commons, and pushing the frontier of the multilateral action. And the next section, which is called Tools of Trade, is a national progression of the previous one. So once we identify small states and their broad role in helping out, shaping multilateralism, we then explain specific tools that small states can pull up from their toolbox and use it to advance their collective agency further. So we listed 4 tools, or you can say techniques, which are expertise for niche diplomacy, shares power, coalition formation, and serving as mediator. If you notice, all our examples in this section are actually focused on collective agency or collective action by small states, not how individual small states did things to advance their own individual interests. So why so? It is because we want to highlight, as Adam said, the power of international cooperation, power of pooled resources that can drive changes in the UN system. So if you read closely, you'll notice that we try to deliver one message in this section, which is that cooperation among small states matter because it increases their collective agency, and with that collective agency, it leads to real changes in international system. So once we finish the section on tool of trade, we anticipate that the reader will ask, okay, this is great report, great insight, where to go from here, right? So we then provide our answers to this question in our final part called Recommendations for Small State, where we listed 7 recommendations that small state can adopt to advance their agency further. And we have to admit that this is the most difficult part to write for a few reasons. I think as Adam mentioned about the negotiation of Pact of the Future, we were writing this part when the Pact of the Future negotiation was ongoing. And there were some points that we fear that the Pact would not see the light of the day, because it's a very tough one, right? Tough negotiation. So we have to think hard about how to write recommendations that are outcome-proof, meaning that recommendation that small states can adopt, even though the Pact, regardless of whether the Pact negotiation would succeed or fail, right? So we have to think along that line. And also, we are determined to make our recommendation very forward-looking and flexible as possible, because we understand that things changes over time. So our recommendation need to be flexible to be applied to different issue areas along the road. And last but not least, we also wanted our last part to be an opportunity for us all to call for action in specific area of the UN system, because we noticed that some specific areas in the UN really need reform. So that's why when you read our recommendation, you notice that they consist of broad ones and the issue-specific ones. And with that, I'll stop here and then pass the mic to Joel.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a bit difficult being the last speaker after such an eminent list of speakers, and on top of that, a very short report, which Adam and his unsung hero, Albert, his editor, reminded us was very, very important to make sure that people actually read the thing. But in this very short report, it turned out that we had to leave out quite a bit. Right? It was a pity, because we, having spoken to so many small states, found out so many interesting contributions that they had made in the past, the ways in which that they had achieved those aims, and the ways in which they had made an impact on the international system. We had really, unfortunately, to leave out a lot of detail, somewhat to the chagrin of some small states as well. And so I thought perhaps I could flesh this out a little bit, but boringly I'm going to be Singaporean and talk about Singapore's perspective a little bit. And unfortunately, Ms. Bunyan has already said almost everything I was going to say. So I'm not sure what contribution I can actually make here. But I want to make 3 points. So first, Singapore has, as many people have already remarked, had a very active approach to multilateralism in general. It's as convener of this Forum of Small States, but also here within our own region of Southeast Asia, its contributions to ASEAN have been very strong and long-standing since the very founding of ASEAN, of course. And the reason why, and the first point I want to make, is that for Singapore, regionalism and multilateralism have always been a core part of our national interests, right? So if we look at the founding fathers of Singapore and the kind of approach to international relations they took, they viewed the region as fragile and inherently vulnerable to instability, insecurity, and so forth. And so from the very start, Singapore felt it necessary, not just important, but necessary to build a regional project. And that, of course, starts with ASEAN, right? Singapore realized that this stable neighborhood was important for its own survival. What that means when small states say that, or as Adam pointed out, that it's in our DNA. Well, what that means is it's part of our existential needs as a small state to have a stable neighborhood. And within that framework, if you go further, you realize that economic growth is an essential part of stability, right? So if the region is growing and it's performing well, then that contributes and deepens the stability of the region, as opposed to if it were fundamentally going through crises or turmoil, in which the stability starts to unravel. So Singapore's regional interest, therefore, was also to promote economic stability, and not just for itself, but for the whole region as a whole. So as a result of this, Singapore, therefore, promoted the economic community in ASEAN particularly. It was an early driver of the ASEAN economic community before we had a charter and before we had the ASEAN community project more broadly. And the reason why it needed to do this, the thinking behind this, was that a rules-based system would be important for developing that economic community, right? So the second point I want to make is, having identified regionalism as a core Singapore interest, rules-based framework is also a necessary part of developing that regional integration, right? As a rules-based system is established, you get the predictability and stability of stable interactions between the member states of the region. They're able to engage with each other. They have understand what kinds of reactions are likely to come about even when disputes or differences arise, and that stability and restraint, mutual restraint among states, actually builds cooperation and trust in the region. Right? So if you think about our regional developments in terms of building a rules-based system, you think about 1976 and the Bali meeting, the second summit that ASEAN held, where we developed things like the Southeast Asian Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, the Southeast Asian Nuclear Weapons-Free Zone, Declaration of Bali Concord, and so forth, that were all essential parts of creating that early rules-based framework that was intended to stabilize the region. You might recall 1976, we just had the fall of Saigon and the fears that there might be some kind of domino effect in our region, right? And if you think about that, that's the period of the Cold War, when tensions between the great powers were extremely high. Of course, they were might have been a Cold War between the great powers, but it was definitely a hot war in Southeast Asia going on. And yet, we were trying to still create new rules and norms in our region to work hard to do that. The opportunity to really strengthen them actually came about after the Cold War, when Southeast Asian states were a little bit more, or the stakes were a little bit lower, and the so-called unipolar moment, when the West had overcome the communist threat in the East, allowed for actually the deepening of that rules-based framework. So the rules-based community accelerates during this time. The ASEAN Free Trade Area or Agreement of 1992 is the start of this, but as we know, the ASEAN Charter, ASEAN Economic Community, and ASEAN Community in general are driven during this moment. At the same time, at the global level, you have Singapore promoting things like transforming the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs into the World Trade Organization. As Bunyan has pointed out, we are actively involved in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and other global international treaties. Most recently, we have been involved in something called the High Seas Treaty, or Boundaries Beyond National Jurisdiction, which, if you think about it, is remarkable because Singapore doesn't actually have or border any of such boundaries. We're actually completely hemmed in by Indonesian and Malaysian waters. So the fact that we're still actively engaged in global and international treaties and trying to work for the health of our regional neighborhood is part of that commitment to rules-based systems. Finally, as alluded to by Adam as well as Melly, we're now entering a period of global geopolitical tensions, right? Or we're already deep within it, right? And so the observation, as Karen pointed out, is that it's going to be a lot harder. It's going to be harder to do this rulemaking. Multilateral cooperation is going to be harder. And so this means that we're probably not going to be as successful as that period in the 1990s and early 2000s when a lot of rulemaking and creation of multilateral frameworks was most rapid, I think. Right? So this is where we come back to the report. As we come into this moment of geopolitical tension, right, the outputs are going to look a little bit disappointing. To be very honest, the summit and the Pact of the Future are remarkable achievements, but if you think about the negotiations that went on with it, it's often the case that everyone was a little bit unhappy, which meant that certain compromises needed to be made, right? And yet, even if the outcome is disappointing, if we focus only on the outcome being disappointing, we'll fail to see that actually what was more important was the ability to cooperate. And Adam actually brought in a lot of great points about how the FOSS brought together core groups of states with much greater aligned interests than is normally recognized. We tend to see the great powers who are great rivals disagreeing over each other and thinking that the whole multilateral system is unraveling. But yet in this Pact of the Future process, we had small states coming together, finding a great amount of alignment and overlap and agreement on the critical issues, the need to address new and emerging issues that have not yet had multilateral frameworks or rules and norms. And this agreement was then a powerful shaper or driver of the Pact of the Future. So Singapore has been critical in convening this. We don't necessarily get to have the final say on all of these processes, certainly not, but that process of making sure that cooperation continues amid geopolitical tensions is essential. Now finally, just to think about small states' role here, in IR or international relations, there's often this concept of threat perception. And among big powers, the threat perception between major powers is always a problem, right? It's always that we can't know exactly what the other state is doing. We better be a little bit on our guard, and therefore it's hard to build trust and cooperation between rivals. Now, small states have an unusual characteristic, which is that there is very little threat perception because they're too small. A state like Singapore cannot threaten a state like Indonesia. It's just impossible. And similarly, when we went around the world and we talked to all the representatives from small states, we realized, yes, that innocuous kind of unthreatening sort of position that they occupy wherever they happen to be gives them that ability to really drive cooperation when otherwise the greater powers are unable to do that. So I think, as my final point, it's that the continued role of small states is not just some sort of PR stunt that we're trying to pull and give ourselves a role that is important. It's actually part of our our character as small states that gives us the ability to actually make this fundamental contribution. Thank you.
A very good afternoon to everyone. I would like to express my thanks to Karen and the team at the RSIS Center for Multilateralism Studies for the invitation to serve as discussant for this report. So let me start by congratulating the authors, Adam, Karen, and Joel, for a really, what I thought was a really excellent and timely report that underscores the critical role played by small states in upholding multilateralism and international law. Well, conventionally, and well, I see some of my students here as well, and I'm so sorry, but I'm going to repeat a lot of things that we covered in class. So I'm going to ask for your patience. But conventionally, the study of international relations, right, has put the spotlight on the great powers or the major powers. And the perception is that, unfortunately, small states lack strategic heft or strategic weight. But as we know, small states actually make up quite a significant number of countries in the international system, right? If we go by membership of the Forum of Small States, I believe the current membership stands at 108 countries out of close to 200 states around the world. And while small by traditional or material metrics of power, these states do have agency and they can work to shape a more stable international order. So it is clear that the authors have given a lot of thought to what small states can do, as well as the tools at their disposal. So you all have a copy of the report with you. I won't go into details about what the report covers, but I thought I would just share 3 particular points in the report that really stood out to me. So the first, of course, is the natural relationship between small states and multilateralism, right? So I see 2 aspects to this. One is that small states are unable to individually influence global decision-making. Therefore, they benefit from being a part of coalitions, right? More specifically, like-minded coalitions. So it's a strength in numbers, if you will. And these coalitions help to ensure that their concerns are included in global agendas and that their interests are secured. 2 is that multilateral platforms such as the UN contribute towards the institutionalization of rules and norms that apply to all their participants, right? So in this sense, countries with, say, more powerful militaries or economies are restrained from unilaterally imposing their preferences on the smaller states, or at the very least, they incur some costs when they try to do so. And as the authors eloquently write, small states, I quote, cannot adhere to the idea of might makes right, as they do not possess big militaries or economies. As a result, small states tend to seek cooperation and collective action to foster a stable and rules-based international system where all states, regardless of size, can thrive, unquote. For these reasons, multilateralism is a natural priority in the foreign policies of small states, and it is regarded as one of the pathways that small states can use to overcome their structural or material constraints. The second thing that stood out to me in the report was the dual dynamic, I think, that characterized some of the pertinent themes. So for example, the report is very forward-looking, right? It calls for capacity building in issues like sustainable development, climate change, pandemic prevention, as well as digital systems, right? These are all issues that are intertwined with the future of the world. So on the one hand, the recommendations are very forward-looking, but on the other hand, the report also advocates for a need to get back to basics, which refers to the fundamental purposes and principles of the UN Charter, right? So these would include taking collective measures against acts of aggression, settling disputes according to international law, upholding sovereign equality. So there is a perceptible sense that, to move forward to address emerging global challenges, we must look back to the origins of post-World War II global governance and the principles of international law, right? What were their objectives? How were the institutions designed to achieve those objectives? And how would these elements then feature in the responses towards future challenges? An important question here, which Karen alluded to, is also what kind of reforms are needed to ensure that the basics continue to be achieved. Another example of this dual dynamic is that the report focuses clearly on small states on the one hand, but it also emphasizes the roles and responsibilities of the major and middle powers in maintaining peace and stability. Right, so the authors write about small states serving as venues where the diplomatic delegations of major powers can meet, which facilitates close contact and communication channels. Likewise, they also write about the potential for middle powers, small states to work together to advance multilateralism. So in that sense, although small states are the focus of the report, it is evident that major and middle powers also play a crucial role in shaping the future of the multilateral system. And last but not least, to me, I think the report clearly speaks to the literature on small states, right? So specifically, while reading this report on small states and the multilateral system, it brought to my mind an article written by Robert Keohane that was published in 1969, right? So this article was titled Lilliputian's Dilemmas, Small States in International Politics. And in that article, Keohane classified the world's states into 4 categories, right, based on how their respective leaders perceived the potential to influence the system by their own countries. So the first category was great powers, whose leaders believed could individually exercise a large and potentially decisive impact on the international system. Second was secondary powers, whose leaders perceived would be unable to individually dominate the system, but might be able to shape it through various strategies. Third category, a group known as middle powers, whose leaders expected that they would never be able to shape the international system on their own, but they could have some kind of impact through coalitions, alliances, or international organizations. And finally, we have small states, right, or small powers, whose leaders perceived that they could do little to influence the system, regardless of whether they are acting alone or in a large group, right? So a bit pessimistic at the time. But that goes back, to a point I raised at the beginning, which is the perception that small states lack strategic weight to influence system-level outcomes, right? So vis-a-vis Keohane's argument in 1969, I think this report has demonstrated that small powers or small states can have a concrete impact on the multilateral system, and that collectively, as the authors write in their conclusion, small states have a significant role to play in ensuring that humanity has a brighter future. So once again, congratulations to the authors for this really outstanding piece of work. It is now my pleasure to open the floor to questions and comments from the audience. If you would like to speak, please raise your hand. I believe the mic would come to you. I would ask that you keep your question or comment concise, and please introduce yourself before you pose your question or comment. Could we have the first question, please? Okay, so if you need some time to think about your questions, I will start off with the first question. And I think that goes back a bit to what Joelle mentioned earlier, because you focus a lot on ASEAN, right? And I mean, in the context, I think especially on the Indo-Pacific, how can regional organizations with small states, or with mostly small states, so organizations like ASEAN or the Pacific Islands Forum, are there any opportunities for them to work together, so kind of cross-organizational collaboration to bolster multilateralism?
Okay. Actually, Adam is very good on cross-regional collaboration because from his vantage at FOSS, he sees it actually happening all the time. So I'll give a limited answer, maybe if you want to come in. But this idea that we had raised actually towards the end of the report, we talked about coalition building. And we said that coalitions are most powerful when they kind of perhaps overcome the geopolitics by sheer force of numbers. When small states, particularly as the drivers of these coalitions, bring together their perspective on the issue, depoliticize them at the great power level, take out the great power politics part, and then focus on the technical aspects of it. Now, the problem, of course, is that small states don't have that economic heft. They can't say, well, we can offer our markets to deal with this because our markets are actually rather small and relative to the larger states. So cross-regional cooperation with the small states in building larger and larger masses of numbers of states could be very useful, but it hasn't yet happened, in my opinion. Mainly because regions tend to be rather, not that they're inward-looking, but that they're so concerned with their own affairs that it's hard to consider or bring the framing or perspective of other regions that have very different perspectives into their own calculus as well. I think, though, to the extent that actually great power rivalry becomes a global phenomenon, we're seeing increasingly that actually the small states do recognize that some of these problems, things like going on at the WTO and so on, are starting to threaten their core interests wherever they happen to be found, that they are more likely to bring about these cross-regional coalitions. The thing is that they don't necessarily fit in a sort of formal structure. Like, you're not going to see ASEAN and Pacific Islands Forum coming together with a specific sort of connection, but it will probably, or as far as I can see, it starts with smaller coalitions of the willing, where you have individual member states. New Zealand and Singapore, for example, have been driving some of these initiatives, and then they can perhaps bring in their regional allies together and maybe reach a sort of critical mass. So I think that's something that we might see more of, but it will need quite a lot of effort and thinking outside the box, because it doesn't really fit into sort of our conventional international organization frameworks.
Sure, I guess maybe two thoughts. That it's an interesting question, actually. I mean, in terms of thinking in terms of institutions, because we talk a lot about regional organizations in relationship to the universal organization, to the UN. Because there's a framework, Chapter 8 of the Charter, and regional frameworks and such. You don't see too much structural interaction between regional organizations themselves, between the OAS and ASEAN or something. Maybe at the IPI, my frame is often focused on peacekeeping, peace and security issues and such. So I think there are some AU, EU kind of and trilateral cooperation with NATO and such, but it's maybe more ad hoc in most ways. But what I do think in terms of the small state question, the question around cross-regional coalitions, I think it's potentially really important today. And again, I see this through a peace and security lens. Kind of going back to this process that led to the Pact for the Future, as you know, this whole process, or perhaps you know, started with the UN 75 declaration. What was that? Now 3 years ago or something like that. And the Secretary General produced a report called Our Common Agenda, and then a series of policy papers that fed into what became the Pact for the Future. One of those was a new agenda for peace. New agenda for peace identifies trust, universality, and solidarity as the key principles for an effective collective security for the world. Trust is fundamentally, in many respects, at the lowest point it's been in decades. Small states have a real important role, I think, in helping to build trust back up in the system through these kinds of conversations that bridge regions, kinds of governments, alliance structures, and the like. We just had a meeting of the BRICS, right? I think what the BRICS tells you, and what small state cross-regional conversations tells you, is this idea that we're hurtling into a new Cold War where everybody has to pick one side or another is not actually how it's playing out. Member states are not interested in dividing the world up into one or two, and in particular, small states have no interest in that. And so I think that if small states can, and I think this is actually one of our recommendations in the report, focus on building institutionally and substantively cross-regional approaches to a whole host of issues that are on the agenda that can help to rebuild trust in order to advance a bit more constructive engagement in the world. And I think that's a really important role for small states to play.
Thank you.
I added just a little bit of build on what Adam and Joel said. I think maybe not a formal like alliance like ASEAN hyphen IPF kind of thing, partnership. But I think with this, the conversation made me recall, I think, the discussion at the roundtables organized by IPI. I think there was some permanent representative to UN saying about coordinating efforts, right? Like we are a small state in a different blocks, in a different groupings in our own regions, right? If we want to push for certain ideas, we can coordinate our efforts, right? Try to, let's say, push for topic X in like Singapore within ASEAN, work with like-minded ASEAN member to push for topic X in ASEAN. Some small states in Latin America could do that in their own, regional grouping as well, right? And in Europe as well. So if we push at the same time, it will raise the awareness of that particular topic and we could get more discussion going on at the global level. So I think it's more coordinating effort like that I think may be more feasible to do than like formal alliance or institutionalized version of different groupings partnership. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Any question? Could we get a mic to the gentleman in the front row?
It's working. Keith Conway, New Zealand Deputy High Commissioner to Singapore. So I'd just like to echo earlier sentiments around just congratulations to the authors for a fantastic report, and thank you for the acknowledgement of the New Zealand Permanent Mission in New York, which has worked alongside Singapore and other partners to develop this wonderful resource. Noting, I think I mentioned this earlier to Adam, 2013, New Zealand had kicked off a similar process or provided some funding for a similar report. So it's great, it's evolved, and small countries are engaging this really important piece of work. I just might touch on the last point around opportunities for sort of regional organisations to work together in multilateral fora. So specifically to that Pacific Island Forum ASEAN relationship, which is quite interesting because last year or earlier this year, ASEAN Secretariat and the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat signed an MOU to share information on organisational structures, how they manage conversations with dialogue partners. So the Pacific Island Forum, the Pacific is becoming an increased arena for geostrategic competition, increasing interest from larger powers in the region. So I know PIF, for example, is interested to see how ASEAN has managed some of those conversations and managed those conversations with larger powers in the context of Southeast Asia. So there's actually a review of the PIF's dialogue partner structures at the moment, and they're leaning quite heavily on the ASEAN example as well. So through that kind of information exchange of sort of knowledge between these regional organisations, that might provide a foundation in the future for greater engagement and talking about how regional organisations can work together in bigger fora as well. So just a final point. So I think a good example around how Southeast Asian and Pacific countries have come together in multilateral fora is the Vanuatu ICJ opinion. So this was initiated by Vanuatu 2 or 3 years ago. The purpose of going to UNGA to have requests referred to the ICJ on countries' obligations under international law in regards to climate change. There's a small group of countries who are drafting the questions for the ICJ. That includes Singapore, New Zealand, Vietnam, Samoa, Marshall Islands, a number of smaller countries. So again, these are countries with common interests in existential challenge of climate change, actually working together in a multilateral format. A small group of nations trying to start a conversation, build consensus, and perhaps build sort of a larger building block to work with larger countries in the ICJ and the UN as well. So I won't go on, but that's just an observation I thought was a very apposite question raised, Sarah.
Thank you. Thanks, Keith. Would any of the panelists like to respond to Keith's comment? No? Okay, then we'll take a second question. We'll go to this gentleman first in the front row, and then we'll go to the gentleman at the back row.
Thank you. Francesco Mancini, Vice Dean at the Lee Kuan Yew School. Thank you. Very interesting report. I was wondering if through your roundtables and conversations in New York, did you identify any areas in which small states have more space for action? As we all certainly agree that small states are not only price takers, they also require to be risk taker. And I wonder if in this particular geopolitical context, one, isn't it hard for small states to take initiatives or to make moves, and they maybe prefer to be careful? And two, is there particular areas that you saw might be more promising, right, than others in which small states can actually make a difference today? Thanks.
Let's take another question before we go back to the panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Adam, Dr. Karen, Dr. Joel, and Dr. Sarah for your insights. I'm Alden, currently a local junior college student. If I may kindly set some context before getting into my question. So in the report, it is very heartening to note that small states are champions of international law through bringing forward bilateral and multilateral cases. However, I recently came across a symposium held by the Center for International Law at NUS, whereby an entry reported that there's an increase in what the academic termed as mega political cases being submitted to the ICJ. So my question is, do you think that this recourse by small states to international litigation to uphold international law will actually come at the expense of multilateral negotiations to resolve issues that are fundamentally political? So if you use the example of Vanuatu's role in submitting the advisory opinion on climate change to the ICJ, do you think that this will take the focus away from political negotiations at COP, and in this opting for legalistic measures that obviously takes time and might not be the most effective in producing outcomes, do you think that this would be productive or instead counterproductive? Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we start with Joel, and then we can go down the line?
Okay. Yeah, it's hard to know if there's an area that isn't being politicized anymore that would have been this traditional sort of low-hanging fruit for small states to get active in or proactive in forging areas. But particularly in the roundtable on frontier issues, the areas where there is not yet a consensus and there's not yet a sort of conventional wisdom about certain approaches, I think it's really important for small states to rush in and fill that up. We might not get our way, and probably won't, but some remarkable things can occur in that instance. I think the African Union has a common position on a common digital position or something like that. They adopted by consensus with their 55 members. Many of whom are small states. Even though they probably are not going to be very influential in digital frameworks, they've put that out there fast, and before, while all of us are bickering about what should go into digital policy, they've put out a common position. And so first movers do still have advantages, and small states might be better placed to do that kind of first moving. As Adam said, we have witnessed already very clear, strong alignment on many issues, particularly the threats or precariousness that small states feel in this increasingly turbulent world. And so that kind of area where we already have great alignment and common purpose and the ability to fill that space up quickly might be one of the things. I'll just say on the ICJ point, now, politicization of international legal institutions is worrying, deepening, and getting more severe over time. And I think great powers do have many ways in which they can undermine international legal institutions. We see this with the WTO and their failure to confirm appellate judges, well, the US failure to confirm them. And what happens then is that we end up reinventing the wheel. So in much the way the WTO has now got this something MPIIA process, which is a coalition of the willing of mostly small states, but also some much larger states who are creating a parallel tribunal to where everyone is consenting to subject themselves to WTO rules and arbitration. This allows them to continue to have the working mechanism that already existed, but just doesn't have this sort of formal connection with the institution. So I think, yeah, we're going to end up reinventing the wheel, because the history of the 20th century was that we had to create these institutions for cooperation. Now that certain great powers are no longer interested in them, fine, we can't do much about that, but we'll continue to work with parallel structures until such a time, hopefully, that they come back to the table.
Just to add on what Joel said, I think the frontier issue will be the promising area where small states can enhance their agency, and because I think, and also just refer back to our point on inside the tool section, we listed expertise for niche diplomacy, and as a tool. So I think on the frontier fund, expertise is required to convince, to persuade other countries, because expertise would be, technical expertise especially, would be needed to convince other states buy-in of your solution to tackle global challenges. And just, this is not, this example is not in our report, but I recall there was either Norway or Sweden in the European small state in the European nation in the 1980s or 1990s. They have certain expertise, technicalities that they know how to regulate banking system, and they actually influence, use that, push forward that idea, and that actually reflect in some changes in the international financial institutions like IMF and World Bank. So yeah, so to leverage on niche expertise, I think to push forward your governance idea at the frontier issue would be maybe one of the most promising avenue for small state to take. Thank you.
Yeah, the conversations at the roundtables and the question about where there was perception for opportunity for small states. I mean, I think on a few different levels. I mean, one is what's discussed in the paper, and that is kind of well known, is that there is always going to be opportunities for small state diplomats to show leadership as chairing processes. Because small states are often actually sought out to chair processes because they're seen as sort of less interested in some way as a bigger power or more complicated. And the High Seas Treaty was referenced. Joel was a little bit modest for Singapore, saying that Singapore was involved. Singapore chaired the process, and I think was really instrumental to its success. But also our friend, the PR of Costa Rica, is currently both the chair of the first committee and also the president of the RevCom 4 on small arms, something. Anyway, there's always going to be those opportunities. and that was discussed quite a bit. I think also just sort of on the big issues, I think everybody recognizes that AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, plays a big role on climate issues, and in particular in the COP process. And IPI actually worked with the Maldives, small state of Maldives, on the one of the biggest successes in most recent years under climate, and that was the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund. And I think that was really only possible because of the AOSIS position of representing these collection of small states that have real existential interest in climate action. Another sort of issue that I think was sort of interesting from a peace and security standpoint that IPI has been following is in the face of the diminished effectiveness and legitimacy of the Security Council, there is increased interest in developing the role of the General Assembly on peace and security issues. And anywhere, when you're talking about the General Assembly, you're talking about it's a game of numbers. And when you have 108 member states that are members of the Forum of Small States, that presents a potential role. And most recently, we were actually just talking about this the other night, one of the biggest developments in the last 2 years on peace and security was what's called the Veto Initiative, or sometimes called the Liechtenstein Initiative, which was passed by the General Assembly to anytime there's a veto in the Security Council, that member state who vetoes has to go before the General Assembly and defend their veto, say why they vetoed this. And that was very much an effort of one of the small states, Liechtenstein. And I think as further debates go about how the General Assembly can play a stronger role, that's going to lead to more engagement by small states. Now, some small states are nervous about that, of course, because the repeated votes on Ukraine and Israel-Palestine and such, some member states are like, we don't want to have to vote again. We don't have to, so it is with power comes responsibility. I don't know. One final point on the frontier issues, which Joel mentioned that the current period of time that we are in is not going to be as productive in international rulemaking as it was in the early 90s and such, but there is a tremendous demand for rulemaking on these frontier issues. And demand will lead to some kind of, I don't know what, but something is got to give, and actually annexed to the Pact for the Future that we've been talking about is something called the Global Digital Compact, which lays out some processes for increased governance on digital issues. And small states are going to have to be engaged on those issues.
All right, we'll take another couple of questions. Melly, could we get the mic to Melly and then Miguel?
My voice is loud.
I didn't answer the gentleman's question back, actually.
Oh.
I don't want to skip that.
Oh, okay.
It's super brief about the ICJ and potential conflict. My impression is no, actually. I mean that the call for an advisory opinion from the ICJ on climate is, anyway, from our climate team at IPI, is seen as a positive thing, as potentially adding leverage to negotiations in COP and not a distraction.
Thank you. It's more of a comment than anything, actually. Can you hear me? I really must congratulate not just the authors, but the initiative itself, because I think it is important to remind us, especially in this region, that small states actually matter. Because as you said, we can get caught up in the discourse on geopolitics and the discourse on fragmentation, etc. So one is a question and a comment. I was hoping that is this going to be developed into a bigger report? That's my question, because I think it is very important. And why I think that is important is particularly for, not just for students of IR, but policymakers, fleshing out of examples where small states actually mattered, I think is very important. The frontier issues that you've talked about, Adam talked about the digital compact, but actually there is Karen would know this, one of the examples how small states can actually start things moving is, for example, DIPA, right? The Digital Economic Partnership, which started by Singapore, New Zealand, and Costa Rica, I believe. It's now gaining more countries to participate, and reminds me of how CPTPP actually also started. And maybe things will also start, maybe Singapore and other like-minded states would look at issues about responsible AI, that's one, or even responsible, what do you call that, responsible use of life sciences, which is very critical, right, in light of what's happening, concerns about biosecurity, dual research, etc. So I was hungry to read more from the report, and I think there's really another, there's the need to take this further, right, and double down on examples. You talk about leadership, which is in fact very important, because we always take for granted leadership of small states, right? Because there's always the question of being co-opted, and it is a reality, right? While small states work together, then there's always the power of being co-opted by big states. But how have they been able to stay the course? Like the High Seas Treaty is one, right? So I think examples of this is useful. At the same time, I guess there should be another section on really also, I think, a more candid analysis of the challenges that are met, because it's not all rosy picture, right? And so when somebody reads it, some big countries read it, and they would appreciate really that. That they actually have to pay attention to the Lilliputians of this world, if you like. So that was all. A bigger study, more examples, not just of successes, but of the challenges faced. Because once you talk about lessons learned, then it actually helps in the strategy, right? When you sort of recalibrate how you set agendas and how you move forward. I think that's useful. I can't help but add on regionalism, because this is one of my favorites. I think it is also not just looking at lessons learned, but comparing, as you said, how regions actually deal with existing problems. Once upon a time, we always think about, I'm talking about ASEAN and the EU. We always talk about, ASEAN, looking at the EU for inspiration, et cetera, et cetera. I just came back from a meeting in the EU, and they were saying that everything is so bad in the EU, right? They're talking, they say, lack of centrality and all that. I always felt that I was in the region because centrality was an issue, lack of cohesion was an issue. So I think lessons again learn how regions actually deal with issues, right? Rather apart from looking at how to deal with problems rather than how to deal with agendas for the future. And that I think we have to do more in flagging the modest successes of ASEAN, especially now when EU is under stress, and also the AU is also having a number of issues piled on to their agenda. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Melly. Miguel?
Thanks. I just want also to ask a question to extend the discussion on governing frontier tech. I've read here about the digital force and a lot of the steps that Singapore is taking, which are of course very welcome moves. But there is a hard truth that small states will have to contend, and that is the AI technologies that you have to govern, they are run by companies that are domiciled in great power states. So at some point, you will need to have the buy-in of these great powers in whatever process transpires from the smaller like-minded processes that are taking place today. So how do you think that process will turn about? Bridging the conversations within small states and bridging them towards the processes that may be happening in the US or maybe in the EU or maybe in China, not only to bring a voice to the small states, but also to prevent what Doc Melly was talking about, which is the co-optation, not only by the great powers, but ultimately also the major tech firms, which have gross revenues the size of twice the size of many of these of these small states. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
All right, we'll go back to the panelists. So a very common thread, I think, in the two comments about whether small states, about the limitations and then the relationship to the great powers. Shall we start with Adam this time, and then we'll move down?
Bigger is better. No, I don't. Oh, that's so you're gonna get me in trouble with my co-authors because I was the one who's like, we got to make it shorter.
No, I'm talking about part two.
No, but really, it's a part of a matter of audience, right? So it would be really happy if RSIS took this and built a book around it or something like that. The brevity was by design for it to land in September around the Sum of the Future and be read by very busy diplomats like the Deputy High Commissioner here. And more importantly, also for them to then take it and give it to the principals when they were in town. And this is actually like long for a briefing paper, right? It was probably actually shortened by a lot of the delegations itself. So, but we had a lot of, I think, forget if Joel or Karen mentioned, we had a lot of other examples and such that we actually took out over time. So I think there is a lot of material there and would be great. But as they say, always leave them wanting more. So I'm happy that you want more. Really difficult questions, I think, around the question around governing IA tech, and it's not my area of expertise, so I hesitate to even offer any sort of answer, and I won't give an answer, but I'll give a sort of a reaction. And one part is in relationship to this point about private sector. And it makes me think of another sort of project of ours, IPI, that we just launched a couple weeks ago called the Multilateralism Index. Which is a multi-year study that tracks participation, performance, and inclusivity in the multilateral system over a course of a 10-year period. One of the most robust findings of the index is the dramatic increase in public-private partnerships of various kinds. And obviously on issues related to tech, the private sector is extremely important and influential, and not just on sort of issues around AI. One of the things that was discussed at the roundtables was issues related to outer space, and particularly space technology. You want to talk about private sector influence there. The majority of satellites right now that are going up is private sector, and most of them are being owned by one guy, Elon Musk. Yeah. And we're already seeing sort of, issues of influence there. So that's just to say, I'm with you, it's a very difficult, and it's not, I think this point about it's not all a rosy picture is absolutely pertinent. But I think part of the motivation of the report, part of Singapore's motivation about commissioning this report is to remind small states that small states have agency and must engage. And to the extent that these things are going to be discussed in multilateral fora, small states must engage and must use their power and numbers in order to have collective influence, because it's gonna be a fight, for sure.
Really, thank you so much for your kind words on our report, and definitely I think just to echo what Alan said, is the brevity is in the design, because we want the report to be read widely by general audience and policymakers. So we intentionally make it brief, so to attract your attention. Otherwise, can go on to be a full-length academic paper, which maybe most of you will fall asleep before finishing it. Right? So yeah, I don't know if you recall, but we wrote this. We have multiple drafts and one draft. Under the section of tool of trade, I counted. We have 15 tools instead of 4. You can see how heavy we cut on that, right? So yeah, just to go back to Melly's point about whether we're gonna take it forward. We have material to take it forward, definitely. Yes. So yeah, then we can. Yes, and with that, it could be 3, 4. We have enough for 3, 4 full-length academic paper already with the materials alone. Yes, a question about how to craft the AI governance going forward, right? I think I call Adam as well. I think it's very challenging. I think Miguel, I think you participate in the roundtable organized by I think the AI Singapore, right? That they do a multi-stakeholder approach, right? Multi-stakeholder approach, you know, it have problem as well, right? There's a heated debate over there. So I think going forward, AI is a frontier issue, and the governance will be shaped by multi-stakeholder approach, maybe formal legislation that is done in the EU, and also court cases. There's a lot of court cases going on, like artists is suing AI company, etc. Right? I think we have to observe these dynamics on what's going on and see how it will shape the AI governance going forward. I just want to go back to what Melis mentioned about Singapore as a small state taking leadership in crafting digital economy governance. Right, it's played an instrumental role in shaping up DEPA, which is Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. And as you know, DEPA has what we call modular approach, meaning that section in a DEPA can be taken out and built upon in other setting and other groupings. Right? So I think this is the way that small state can influence the frontier issue. You make the first mover advantage and you craft the agreement in a modular approach that can help, that will facilitate the future usage of certain aspect of agreement to develop future arrangement, future agreement in other regions as well. So I think that is one of the way forward for small state to influence international governance.
Okay, I'll start with Miguel's question. I read today that Russia had instituted a fine of 20 decillion rubles on Google or Alphabet for some failure to comply with some rulings that it had made. And of course, we're quite positive Google is not going to pay that amount of money. So this isn't really even a small state issue necessarily, right? Russia is having trouble with its own compliance, but states and firms are two different types of organization, and states still have the final say on sovereignty and what goes on within their jurisdiction. And so that's what. When Adam alluded to the idea that there's great demand for regulation and frameworks around digital and frontier issues, it's because of this. Both states and firms want to have these regulations. The firms want ones that are friendly to themselves, of course, but states want to retain some control over their the way in which information is processed and stored and so on within their jurisdictions. Right. So this is an ongoing debate. It's not limited to small states, but small states can actually, as I said, put out the early sort of common frameworks, even if they're a bit basic or a little bit general and not too specific, at least put some guardrails out early and quickly. And I hope that's how they go forward. Melly, I know we have shared this same concern on regionalism about how Southeast Asia's model is very different from Europe's model. And the thing is that it's also actually a little bit of a philosophical point about how we do global governance, whether it's top-down or bottom-up. So a small state's perspective is intrinsically the bottom-up version. And since Sarah brought up Kyohain, the top-down version is that you need a hegemon to make any progress, and the lack of progress that many Western scholars felt about Southeast Asia was all about them not identifying any hegemonic moves, and therefore we were moving too slowly and so on. But I think the bottom-up approach is, for my maybe bias, a much more durable one, because it intrinsically requires the consent and buy-in of all of these states in order to make progress. And we don't move too fast unless and until we get that kind of buy-in from states. So I think as I mentioned, we're going to be a little bit disappointed with output initially, because it's going to be a lot slower. But the bottom-up process, I hope, optimistically, will be more durable and more fit for purpose for the 21st century.
I disagree with that. I was saying we should also tell them our lessons rather than...
Yes, right. So I mean, the Europeans, well, they got it wrong.
I won't be so bold as to say that, but
well,
there are a few things they could learn from us.
Okay, this seems like a good time to say that we are very close to time now, so I'll give the last question to L from RSIS.
Thank you, and congratulations on the report. Mine is broader, a broader question. So we've been talking here about small states and writing the report ahead of the Summit of the Future. I'm wondering if you could comment on the outcome document on the pact itself. And you've mentioned there are 53 action points, and so perhaps you could give us insight into what will and will not happen, and also perhaps where you can comment on some of the non-frontier issues that are in the pact. So perhaps some of the bigger, less likely, perhaps reforms that are suggested in that. Thanks.
Oof. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. That's a great question. I recommend everyone read the Pact of the Future themselves. It's a great document. Now, I'm reminded of actually the 2005 World Summit, the one in which the Millennium Development Goals were agreed or adopted. And at the time, if you think about the people who were involved in that negotiation, all of them were extremely frustrated, disappointed, and so on with the negotiation process. It was so watered down, it was so diluted that, what could we possibly do with that? And I think I felt like history repeated itself 20 years later with the Pact of the Future process. The people involved in the frontline negotiations were all a little bit disappointed. But if you think about what came out of 2005, and I'm talking about the sustainable development, what we now call the sustainable development goals, they provided a powerful framework for global cooperation, for understanding development needs of all kinds of states. And the Pact of the Future, again, not a perfect document, but it's a starting point for a new process of cooperation. Now, the reason why we and in our report, but also as reiterated in many places, emphasize going back to basics is because the basics right now are under threat, and that's we can see that at the Security Council. And so as the challenges to basics, global order at a very basic level, as conflicts proliferate, we're going to need to emphasize that a lot if we can't deal with that, we're not going to get to the more advanced things yet. So regardless of the possibility and potentiality of the Pact of the Future, the basics are the fundamental part we need to start on, which is where I'm going to bring Adam in, because he has a lot to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, an enormous question, right? I mean, so I guess a couple things. I mean, this really does cover, these 53 actions covers the entire multilateral system, including the Global Digital Compact, and it's very detailed. So what's going to move forward and what's going to not, anybody's guess. But there's a few things that I would just say. One is there is within, the UN loves a process to then point to another process, and then maybe another process. So, so there will be a review of implementation of the Pact for the Future at the 83rd session. We're in the 79th, so in 4 years there will be mandated actually have to come back and have an assessment. And I think that you know, as sort of Joel was alluding to, I think on the one hand, it's such an ambitious document, right? Trying to chart the course for the future for transforming global governance. Expectations are, you know, or ambitions are incredibly high, but because of international politics stuff, you know, ultimately, you know, expectations in terms of how it's actually going to systemically reform the system has to be relatively low. But I think many people see, and I would be one of them, that sees hooks that are there to leverage future progress. One has already happened, actually. Summit of the Future, part of this idea is to try to introduce into the system more long-term thinking, right? Not just future in terms of the, you know, the generation of our children, but future generations. There was part of the debate was the UN should have a special envoy on future generations. That didn't happen, but because of the debates around it, the Secretary General just went ahead and is appointing one. So there's already some sort of leverage there. Obviously, one of the biggest problems in the system is with the UN Security Council. A major reform of the Security Council is not going to happen. It's not going to happen because of this, but I think everybody recognizes that there was actually progress made for the first time in, like, I don't know, 15 years or something like that, on this issue in having a consensus recognition of the problems and a sort of a coalition around where there is consensus and where there is not, which in theory leads towards the possibility of textual negotiations, which has never happened before. So again, a hook for potential progress. And I think you go through the document systematically, you'll find a lot of those different sort of things that are adding to points in which those who are interested parties and civil society and such can say, hey, you guys agreed to this. Let's do something about it.
Karen, would you like to? All right. So with that, I think we'll conclude the Q&A session. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for the responses.